It's about to, there we
Oh,
go.
thanks, Ashton. All right, good to see everyone. This morning, Jeff K has offered to lead us into lecture 15. Thanks for taking that on, Jeff.
Matt, that's I'm doing next week, lecture 16.
Oh, really? Okay, that's our mistake. um, in that case, let me just get out my notes here and improvise. It's mostly review, right? So that's okay. It's been a busy week, so I think that over.
Misread, misread the numerals.
Yeah, give me just a second here.
Well, so, he starts out by talking about um, needing to conceive of these of the different systems that Steiner delineates according to the principle of metamorphosis, and then brings in the long bone and the cranium and insists that in order to understand how these are connected according to the principle of metamorphosis, we have to go outside of space. So there's a start.
Right. And he's continually referring to the impossibility of forming whole number ratios between the periods of revolution of the planets of our system. That when we try to do so, we arrive at incommensurable numbers. We have to cease calculating. Um, and I can intuit what he means here and have been, I think Ashton and I have both been looking into the um, more standard astronomical explanation for this. And I haven't found anyone else who specifically mentions this issue. The closest astronomers come to it is in acknowledging just um, the lack of being able to know precisely the initial conditions of the planets. And so when you try to calculate out indefinitely into the future where the planets of the positions will be, you can only go so far. I think maybe a million years. That might even be more than one can predict out with great accuracy, just because of small differences in the initial conditions can magnify over the course of time, such that you can't predict where the planets will be. Given sufficient time. But I find that that statement that he keeps returning to so rich, but a bit enigmatic. So I maybe we can come back to that.
Yeah. I was really struck, as he continues to deepen this theme of the transformation that one, I guess, would participate in following the poles from one extreme to the other. He brings it into projective geometry and just this discussion of anti-space, and he eventually gets to this image, which I guess is supposed to represent like the galaxy, or like what we can observe of the universe and the larger sort of sphere encompassing it, and talks about, sort of leaves off with this vision of the center, what does he say, the like the interior of the moon as having some kind of similarity with what's beyond the the plane of the galaxy, and like outside of that into this sort of immaterial sphere. I don't know, I'm just trying to articulate what I thought I understood. Um, but yeah, just continually moving to different examples of uh, this space counter space dynamic um, throughout the lecture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He says we have to go out of space to understand the movement linking the formation of our human organism with the movements of the heavenly bodies. But he also says that there's a metamorphosis because of the metamorphic relationship between the three parts of the human being, uh, the head and nervous system, the rhythmic system, and the metabolic system and limbs, that we can see correspondences between different organ systems across these three parts. And he relates like the kidneys and the eyes. He said something about the liver, and I can remember before I'd ever read Steiner thinking about when I was reading about embryogenesis and studying the way that our human form develops in utero, that there is initially more of a symmetry between the bottom and the top of the body, and then they gradually differentiate. And it was really kind of blowing my mind that the organ systems in the face, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and so on, you can, if you, and I didn't have the terms for it, but with a kind of Goethean imagination of metamorphosis, see correspondences between the reproductive organs and the organs of the head, and similarly you could do so for the rhythmic system, and trying to understand how every part of our body is a transformation of some underlying archetype, right? And when you can start to grasp that just in the three parts of the body, then there's this next leap to understand the relationship between this microcosm and the macrocosm. And it's Steiner's giving us these hints and these guiding threads to pull on in relating, as he did in a prior lecture, the sun and the moon and the earth's relative relationship to what makes the human form different from plants and animals. And I can see the pathway here, but the and the methodology, but to really work out the true correspondences here, I think remains a difficult task open to us as spiritual researchers. And we're getting close to the conclusion of this book, but I think that's what we're being asked to do, is to develop this methodology and these indications into knowledge. And I feel a sort of impressionistic kind of aesthetic lure towards what these relationships might be like, but I certainly don't have knowledge. And I think we need a community of peers who can support one another to test out different correspondences. And that is community work, right? It's not something that we don't have a lone genius that I've found yet who can do all of this for us. And even if we did have someone like Steiner with us to help guide us, to pursue this type of knowledge requires cultivation of our own direct intuitions of the claims, and not just taking someone else's word for it.
One other element is this that maybe we could mention before opening it up, is just this theme of or this characterization that he gives of the interplay between the radiating from the center into infinite widths, and then this coming from the infinite periphery in, and that there's this, he says, the continuation of what is far away out there makes itself felt in here. The thing that I'm seeking when I go out into infinite distances reappears to me from out of the center. So I just think that's an important thing to also mention. But yeah, Matt and I were just talking yesterday. I was like, what is it that we could attend to, and how could we, and how ought we attend to it in order to like make this what Steiner's describing here a like a perceived an experience in perception? Yeah, so that's a question. But Matt, do you have anything else to say before we open it up?
I don't think so. Yeah, let's just have a conversation. We have a big group today. It's nice to see.
Yes, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Karsten, please.
Hey, I was just wondering if I could share my screen because I have a figure that I would like to show relating to Steiner's talk about the Cassini curves. So if you can allow me to share my screen.
There you go.
Thanks. So it's this figure. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can. Yeah. Okay.
Of course.
So that was new information for me that I somehow stumbled upon today, that these Cassini curves, the particular parameterization of them can actually be seen as an intersection of the figure known as a torus.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never seen that before. So you can think of the different parameterizations, like if you're shifting this intersection from the periphery towards the center, you come from the elliptical or oval shape to the lemniscate, and then to these two distinct figures. And I just thought it was kind of interesting that there is actually a figure that connects these different parameterizations. Of course, I know Steiner is quite explicit that he says that when he's talking about going out of space, he's not talking about going into some higher dimensional Euclidean space. I think he states that quite explicitly. He more wants us to think about this idea of counter space, but I just wanted to share this this figure with all of you.
Karsten, can you say just a little bit more about the relationship between the torus and the hypersphere as another higher? Do you know much about hyperspheres and as a higher dimensional form of the sphere?
No, I don't know about that. Sorry, it's I'd love to. I'd love to be able to say something about it, but that's beyond my capacity.
No worries. It's almost as though it's like putting the torus into motion or something. Let me just briefly.
I mean, the way that the torus comes about is if you. Oh, I haven't seen that before. Okay.
Because you could see how it seems like the sphere opens out into a plane that's going off into infinity and then closes back on itself. I mean, I don't know and there's sort of the torus there. Anyways, I don't know the details of how that might.
No, I haven't seen that before, but of course the torus is produced simply by having a circle and then just rotating it in three-dimensional space.
Right.
This is the way to generate the torus. So maybe Lorenzo, he knows something about this. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so let's move forward here to Rosemary. Lots of hands up.
I'll yield to Max because he has to leave early.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Rosemary. Thanks. Go ahead, Max.
Thanks, Rosemary. I really appreciate that. Something that has stayed with me over the last few meetings that we've had is Matt's kind of summary comment. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, where he described the creative activity of creating space, this activity of creating space by the higher beings. And it's something that has just been on my mind since then. And of course, and so I trying to understand how we are kind of embedded in this space that's being created through the thought and will of higher beings. And I was just considering a couple different, to understand what that means phenomenologically, a couple different examples. And one is, of course, the way we experience space in our dreams. And it's obviously, well, it's an immediate perception of space, but it's not the physical space it's not the same space as we are like accustomed to in the physical world. But the idea is that the space that we're accustomed to in the physical world is also, it's not just some kind of something that's there like an empty container. It's something that's being sustained. And so then the second analogy that I came up with is how, again, there's this kind of immediate intuition of space in music and melodies, really immediately perceptible. Like it's not something you arrive at through thinking about it, it's something you perceive. Like in a melody, the way like the high note to the bottom note, it carves out this experiential space. But again, it's not physical space. But that doesn't mean that it's not there. It's clearly there. And that's, I think, a second example to illustrate this sort of, dynamic and foremost qualitative element to the space. The high notes and the high register, the treble register compared to the bass notes. It's not just the same space, it's a very different quality of space. And so I just thought I'd put forth those examples to just try to kind of flesh out a little bit more the suggestion that Matt made.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I mean, it's not as obvious because of the dominance of a certain Newtonian Cartesian common sense in our time, but this idea of three-dimensional space is so abstract. It's an idea. We don't experience it at all. Right? It's an abstract cage that we've locked ourselves inside of. But as you're saying, there's so many different forms of qualitative space, whether it's auditory space, kinesthetic space, proprioceptive space, that we're experiencing through different modalities of our body, different sensory organs, and it's the tyranny of the eyes and this particular rendering of visual perception in Euclidean terms that dominates common sense understanding of space, but it's totally divorced from our actual experience.
But even the eyes, just to add one final comment, like it's also a tacit, to use Goethe's word, Vorstellungsart. It's like what you said about the Newtonian space, because it's nothing self-evident in the eyes that there is this abstract physical Newtonian space. Because, like, for instance, in order to see the moon or to see a distant starlight, it means, like, in principle, that the star light and the light of the star and the actual like substance of the star is also present in this aperture of your eye. And so there's just if you really drill down, there's no way to defend the Newtonian view of space. And I don't mean to blame Newton for it, but it's just what we call it. There's no way to defend it as like this kind of absolute and conclusive, reality.
Right. I mean, strictly speaking, the visual field would be better represented using projective geometry, not Euclidean, which sort of takes the point of view of the observer kind of out of the picture in a way. Yeah. Angus, please. Oh, wait, Rosemary, do you want to go? And then we'll go to Angus.
Yeah, it follows nicely on what we've been talking about. Several of us have studied projective geometry, and we know the feeling of going out of space, doing those geometry problems. I remember exactly the feeling I had understanding infinity going out and coming back. And you made the point, Matt, that we don't have knowledge, we're building knowledge, but I believe that we do have the spatial experiences and the inner experiences. So we're starting from inner experiences. We may have more or less consciousness and detailed perception of those inner spatial experiences. If we've been doing a lot of meditating for years, for example, lots of people have elaborate inner spatial experiences. And the the challenge that Steiner is giving us is to bring these into more precise language so that other people can get on the journey, start the journey of tracking this inner space. That's it for now.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. I mean, we certainly have a kind of intuitive knowledge. I guess, how do we make this scientific would be what I was asking, which is to say, not just intuitive, but something that can be demonstrated to others. And I know there's a gap there because this is spiritual science and not just natural science. So the demonstration requires the participation of the one we're trying to demonstrate something to. So that challenge remains. Angus, please.
I'm so glad you loaded that with that question. I'm going to try and give an answer after I've pointed out a couple of points. So a few things popped for me this time. I only listened to it, but there's a couple of things. I want to give a couple of general impressions and then point to two specific points in the text, and then come to your question. One of the things that happens for me as I was listening to him today in the car on the way to work is he is focusing on how he's working with the Cassini curves. He is making it mathematically provable that something that is, it's like two objects that are not connected are connected through another realm. Might be one way of describing it, or another way of describing it might be a microcosm in a macrocosm, so like coming through a focal point or something like that. And where it really started popping for me was just after figure 2. He says that to draw the line, we would have to go out of space, coming back into space again when we draw the second branch. Conceptually, our hand would be drawing a continuous line. And it's that continuous line which is saying there's something giving us the illusion that these are separate, but mathematically, analytically, we can prove that they are whole. Yeah, that was one point. And if I'm mucking up in my thinking, then I'd love it if somebody addressed that. So that was one key point. And then just after figure 3, he says something really interesting, which might lead to mathematics and science, and the way I'm seeing it. He describes just under figure 3, if your version is the same as mine. Oh, this is the one on the web, okay? The upper branches will take this form eventually. If then you alter the curve of Cassini by taking variables instead of constants, so that you start with equations instead of starting with invariable constants, you get two different types of branches. And he's got that figure there demonstrating, instead of with the pure Cassini curves, you've got 2 circles. And so going to eyedrops and then lemniscate, and then it's out into the peanut. So what he's doing is he's bringing, you've got your 2 focal points for the Cassini curves. And what he's saying is the constant that the quotient is between those 2 points. If that is varied, if that's turned into a variable in a constant, then you will get non-traditional Cassini curve images, like the one we're seeing there in figure 3 and then figure 4. So coming back to what Carsten was saying, he said, that toroid model, as he accurately said, all you need to do is to spin a Cassini curve through space. It's rotate it, it's 360 degrees, and you've got a 3D model. And there are people doing that relatively simple task on the web. I'll just put a link in the chat here. Where is it, chat? So people can go and look at that. So what this guy here has done, he's described how you can quite quickly go from a 2D Cassini oval to a 3D one just by rotating it. And if my hunch is correct, somebody far more capable than myself would then be able to use that model to do two things. Because in this one, he's only talking about 2 points, and there's this idea that there can be multiple points that make Cassini curves. So you would have on your program, you'd have a slider for the number of points. So that it's 3D modeling around, and I've seen 2D versions of this with multi-point Cassini curves, which is quite interesting to look at. And then the other aspect that somebody far more skilled in mathematics and programming would be able to do would be also to change the constant to a variable. And then you would actually be able to play around with actually how the interaction of variable quotient and number of points actually gives rise to real forms, mathematically based, but then they will be distinct. I've managed to find one single picture so far on the web that demonstrates that. It's where somebody's managed to create a 3D Cassini curve, which is actually made up of 6 parts. And it was 5 parts. A central part and 4 bits around the side. I don't know how much anybody of what I just said understood, but things really started popping with micro, macro. So the constancy, we've got one continuous line, but when we look purely with the visual senses, we see them as separate. But in reality, or in mathematical reality, in analytical reality, they aren't. And that type of process would be possible to demonstrate with somebody very skilled in 3D modeling Cassini curves with those 2 factors in, variable quotient and variable number of points. And I think you would be then able to visualize to somebody what's going on. And then it's if so we won't be able to show exactly how mathematically a vertebrae is turned into a skull form, and similarly how the vertebrae can also become an elongated limb bone or something like that.
Thanks, Angus. I'm going to watch this video later that you linked us to. So is the idea here that using the Cassini curve and the further elaboration on it, trading out constants for variables, that would provide us with not a way of visualizing the
visualizing to somebody that's not, you were talking about scientifically demonstrating this. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I'm envisioning when I was watching this video and listening to the video. It's putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5. That's what began to pop for me. What will come out of that actual project? Obviously, I've got no idea. But that's when I look at the figures that Steiner's mapping out in 2D, and he's describing how you get these variations in forms. That's when I start to believe to see a grander picture.
I mean, all I can say at this point is I find it fascinating that on the one hand, there's a certain scientific materialist common sense that would insist that physical bodies have a continuous trajectory through space. But on the other hand, contemporary physics is more than happy to invent untold numbers of dimensions in order to explain what we are able to visually apprehend. And so they should be open to this method, especially because it would allow for still some continuity between intuition and calculation, even if, we have to go beyond just our visual form of intuition in order to, there's a higher kind of intuition, imaginative perception perhaps would be the better term.
I suspect from reading stuff a long time ago that also if that variation was brought in and it was mapped to perhaps the retrograde motion of planets or the planets around the stars. It's like using that as the variable constant, because I know Steiner has talked about growth patterns on trees as being, it's like trees are associated with the planets in Steiner's world. So that would be one of the first places I would start playing to select, see, when I'm playing with this computer simulation, but I'm using like the Venus, some aspect of the Venus, like traveling around the sun, is that also giving me what I see in a birch tree? Something that's unique to, not necessarily unique, but sort of like is signatory of the birch tree, for example. I can see Lorenzo nodding his head there. I think he's nodding his head. But so I look forward to hearing why you're agreeing there. Seem to be agreeing there, Lorenzo.
Thanks, Angus. Yeah, Bart, you're next, and then we'll get to Lorenzo.
All right, if Lorenzo has like direct comment there, you're welcome to go ahead of me.
Okay, yeah, because I wanted to answer to Angus, so thank you. I'll take the chance. And yeah, well, I wanted to point our attention to what Steiner says just after the part that Angus was referring to, where he introduces counterspace, and he also introduces this idea that we can think about, let's say, two-dimensional space that once was three-dimensional because there was a subtraction. And so just to link to what Angus was saying, my understanding at this point is that in the ontogenesis, in the structure of living things, maybe not just living things, also minerals, in a way, in the structure of what exists, we can find maybe the trace of normal distributions in higher dimensions that then are, let's say, reabsorbed. So the relationship with, as Angus was saying, let's say a model where I compare the birch, the shapes, the significant and characteristic shapes of a determinate plant, and the movement of celestial body, and through the mathematical curve of the Cassinis, maybe what we should do is to expand a third dimension, an imaginary third dimension, see what kind of shapes the Cassini develops there, then project it back to a two-dimensional plane, and then maybe do it again from another point with another celestial body or something like that, and then seeing if in the shapes that we see in nature we can see this kind of trace, yeah, that you were talking about. I just wanted to add this idea that maybe the step relating to counter space is that sometimes we have to develop these three-dimensional shapes, then turn them back to a two-dimensional projection, and work again, because this, of course, influences the final shape that we see. And so maybe that's what, at least that's my interpretation of what Steiner is saying there. And if anybody has another intuition, please share, because I find that part maybe the most mysterious of this chapter. And yeah, that's how I connected to what Angus was saying, and to the discussion about the Cassini curves that just precedes it in the chapter. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just observing, a tree out the window, and the way that, the trunk grows up from the ground, and obviously the roots are differentiated under the soil. But, when a tree branches out, if we were to only take the two-dimensional cross section, yeah, just like the Cassini curve, it appears like there would be two separate, branches. And just thinking about the solar system, the planets, sort of differentiating over the course of cosmic history in a similar way, and that we're only seeing a lower dimensional projection, and so don't see the trunk out of which these planets are differentiating, and so that they really remain one organism, as Steiner was saying in an earlier lecture. If we could perceive them in their true qualitative organic reality, but our visual senses and our three-dimensional imagination only allows us to see them, as it were, projected as though they were on a flat surface, as if we were bisecting the tree beyond its initial trunk into the branches, right? I don't know if that image is being conveyed well, but Bart, you were gonna chime in.
Yeah. So kind of one theme that's run through all these lectures that I've been kind of turning around in my head over the past several weeks, trying to kind of come have a picture of it, is like in these mathematical models of space, he comes back to it again in the beginning of this lecture, to this irrational numbers idea, where ultimately, if you're trying to plot the path of an elliptical orbit, you end up with an irrational number. And kind of, if you follow those irrational numbers out, toward infinity, you kind of reach the boundary where at the boundary of infinity, where all boundaries dissolve, right? Everything kind of all the data points, kind of the differentiation between the different data points, all kind of the boundaries dissolve, and they kind of become one thing. And I've been kind of trying to picture what that looks like, and also kind of what's on the other side of that boundary. And I think when he somehow kind of, that's what he's hinting at when he, in like maybe figure 4 and 5, is it? And also in the kind of point where the trajectory in animal development turns back to human development. Let me find the picture here. Yeah, figure 3 and 4, the space in between, and also figure 2, actually, where you have these lemniscates you have the lemniscate, but then you also have the two kind of well, you have the part of the lemniscate that falls out of space. And so that kind of also got me thinking about, I don't know if people are familiar with Steiner's seed meditation, but he talks about when you meditate on kind of growth and death of a plant and you meditate on the seed, there's a point in the development of the life of that plant where there's no longer any physical material left from that seed. So, as the seed kind of goes under the earth freezes over winter, and then kind of the forces of the sun, the seed starts to feel the forces, the warmth of the sun as spring comes up. There's a point underneath the ground where there's nothing left there is no physical material of that seed, and yet a new plant grows up in the spring from that seed. So I'm not sure, I don't have any kind of conclusive anything to like add to that, but somewhere out there kind of beyond the path of irrational numbers and like into infinite reality, I think that's the space he's trying to get us to imagine.
Yeah, I like Ali's comment there, the seed of Theseus, the ship of Theseus, in which Platonic dialogue is it? But you replace one plank on a ship and then replace another and another until every plank has been replaced, and ask, is it still the same ship? I mean, in the biological world, it's always the form that persists even as the matter cycles through, right? Thanks, Bart. Karsten, did your hand go back up? Yeah, please.
That was actually a very good introduction to what I wanted to say. So I was thinking about all these dualities that Steiner and again point us to. And also, first, I would like to say, I think I heard the American philosopher Robert Brandom, he said, dualism is something you have if you make a distinction in such a way that no relation is possible between the distinguished entities. But you can make distinctions without making a dualism if you just make the distinction in such a way that some kind of relation is possible between that which you have distinguished. I think that's kind of a good observation by Robert Brandom. And I think the interesting thing about Steiner, he's talking about these dualities. So you have the duality between the head and the metabolic system, or the nervous system and the metabolic system. And you have the duality between the radial movements from the center outwards and the inward movements from the periphery towards the center. And you have the duality between the inner planets and the outer planets. And so I think there's something very profound there in these hidden, so to speak, in these dualities. And it made me think of, so it made me actually go a bit back to riddles of philosophy and this evolution of consciousness down through the ages, where if you go back to Aristotle, you had this idea of the mind of God, in a sense. When Aristotle talks about the mind of God or the divine consciousness as thought thinking itself, it's kind of a seed, you could say, that was sown in the consciousness of humanity. And then as we move up through the ages, this idea of the mind of God, it takes different forms. So Spinoza, he has his version, but also Kant, interestingly, he has his idea of the mind of God, and it's actually going in two directions. And that's what I wanted to elaborate a bit upon. So one place is what Kant he calls intellectual intuition, which is kind of the transcendental apperception, apperceiving itself, or the I think, thinking itself. And for Kant, it was something that was beyond the reach of human beings. So it's a regulative idea in his language. But then later on in his critique of judgment, he has this idea of intuitive understanding, which is something else, because that's also according to Kant, it's how God would think about living organisms. But again, it's a regulative idea in Kant. It's something that cannot be reached by human beings. So it comes from this idea that when you're looking at living organism, just like Matt he pointed out now, that it's changing all the time. So you have to look at the living organism in such a way that the totality is determining the organization of the parts. So understanding this kind of what is this whole, what is this totality that is determining the organization of the parts of the organism, the individual parts. So that's kind of his idea of intuitive understanding. And then I think it's interesting that those who come after Kant, they kind of pick up on these ideas, but now it's no longer regulative ideas because it's not considered to be something that is beyond the reach of man. So for Fichte, for example, he will take this idea of the intellectual intuition, and he will have this insight that the German philosopher Dieter Henrich, he called it Fichte's original insight. It was the insight into the fact that self-consciousness presupposes itself. You cannot have self-consciousness if you're not already, to some extent, self-consciousness or self-conscious, sorry. So self-consciousness it's something that's absolute. That was Fichte's original insight. And this absoluteness of the self is something you can only acquire insight into through this faculty of intellectual intuition. And then on the other hand, you have Goethe working with the idea of intuitive understanding, having to do with nature and how you observe nature. And you kind of grasp the idea of the whole gestalt that is informing and shaping and invigorating the living organism. So I think you have this duality between intellectual intuition and intuitive understanding. And what we're kind of working towards is having these two meet somewhere in the middle. So also I think it's interesting when you look at modern philosophy, you kind of have impoverished versions of these two modes of thinking. Because if you look at analytical philosophy, it's very naturalistic. It's based on this idea of a third person view on it's kind of a view from nowhere. So in a sense, it's thinking from the periphery towards the center, but it's extremely impoverished because there is no intuition. It's not based on intuitive understanding, but just some kind of analytical understanding. So something is missing there. And the same thing when you think about, say, postmodernism or continental philosophy, it's actually, it's like, if you look at Fichte, it's this idea that from the center, the whole universe is kind of projected radially outwards from the self and towards the periphery. And this you also see in postmodernism, but now there's no self anymore. There's not this intellectual intuition of a self that is creating order and creating kind of wholeness and unity. The self that you have in postmodern philosophy is kind of a psychotic self. It's divided against itself. It's confused. So I think there's some very basic thing about consciousness and thinking at play in these dualities, where I think Stein is he's kind of leading us towards this place where we have the intellectual intuition about ourselves as absolute beings, to some extent projecting things outwardly, radially out into cosmos, but also having intellectual understanding and kind of grasping the archetypes, the gestalts that are somehow informing nature and moving towards us and in a sense communicating with us, but where we need a more receptive say mode of thinking. Yeah, so I just wanted to say one last thing is I've always had it easier with the Fichtean perspective, because when I was 25 years old, at that time I was a diehard atheist and metaphysical materialist, but I kind of had this insight into the fact that we are absolute, unconditional beings who is never born and who will never die. So I always, for many years at least, found it very easy to associate myself with this Fichtean perspective. But what I'm really feeling my limitations is being part of this group where Steiner is much more perhaps talking about intuitive understanding that is grasping the cosmos and the archetypes and so on. And I can see Chad, he wants to chime in now, and I think it's very appropriate, because whenever I listen to Chad, I always have this feeling of a person who is much more intuitive about these archetypes, somehow informing nature. Yeah, so I look forward to hear what you have to say, Chad.
Yeah, please. Thanks, Karsten. Go ahead, Chad.
Yes, thank you so much, Karsten. And when I listen to you or Matt, any of you, I wish I knew more of Kant and the philosopher's perspectives that you were so steeped in richly, so that I could comment a little more effectively about it. But yeah, what you were saying really sparked my imagination and intuition on these ideas, in that I think what the archetypal astrological perspective kind of provides is a third person perspective, in the way that you were, in a sense of like the realism of philosophy, the evolution of consciousness. Bella describes the axial moment as the emergence of second order thinking. And Steiner just, I think, calls it thinking, when thinking really emerges. But I think what I want to backtrack just a little bit, because at the end of lecture 14, I was really tapping into Steiner's pointing towards an ideal point within the structures. And then I'm just going to comment real quickly on something in this lecture. I only listened to the audio, but there was one point where he was describing points receding in out of dimensions, like coming at, like from third, but reversing, going back to nothing. Does that resonate? Do you remember that part? We haven't commented on it today, but I was struck by it, because it seems what Steiner is leading us to do is to develop this higher order thinking, philosophy of freedom orientation, to commune with the archetypes in a conscious way, through our intention. And like, if we go back to, I did an analysis of Steiner's chart, actually, and for was it the Riddles of Philosophy? I forget, but or Philosophy of Freedom. Yeah, Philosophy of Freedom. But in that analysis, we actually are, I think, we're having an insight from a third person perspective that's allowing us insight into the subjectivity of Steiner's thinking and how his thinking evolved in relationship to the archetypes relative to the planetary positions at different periods of his life. And that, I think, is moving towards that, what I think you were saying, Karsten, about the from God's perspective, from the third person perspective. In a sense, it allows us to see inside of what is previously understood as complete subjectivity, the subjective self, the psyche, the individual psyche, through the astrological lens, is freed. It's given a transparency that allows us to see inside of, and then therefore also to participate on a new level with what is already informing us. And it goes right back to the Taurian kind of idea of like the human being is the center that is connected to all of eternity, and the nexus of the three motions of just sun, moon, and earth he describes is in the human being. But it's not just the sun, moon, and earth. It's all of the planets and ultimately all the stars. I am like confused by what Daniel, that section that Daniel posted in the chat as well. When I listened to it, I thought he said including the center of the moon, not excluding it. I actually heard it backwards. So I was like, oh yeah, that's right. So I'm really confused by reading it and saying, you say it does not belong, because I don't understand what he's saying there. But because to me, it seems like we are inside of the moon, like he said in chapter 14, we're inside of all of the planets and the stars as well. But I think there's this way in which this ideal point he was pointing towards in chapter 14 is where our consciousness can move towards and understand and have a more participatory relationship with what is already within us and within the cosmos itself. And your birth chart and your transits actually can help all of us in the way you were describing at the beginning, Matt, that there's no single person that is going to, dispense with the mystery of this understanding. It's going to be brought forth by all of us collectively. And I think that's exactly right. Last thing I'll say is, and maybe I could do it. I'm not prepared to do it now as we're into time, but I think, Matt, you may have used the Archetypal Explorer program once to, like there's a way in which you can actually look at transits and how they converge through the individual person, or because you can see your own personal transits through a time wave, and how the concretions, in a sense, of the planetary alignments align for you, and it actually reflects how you're participating in time. Maybe I could do that. And then I was saying, because that's actually the way he ends chapter 14, is by saying that it's every human being that is a sort of nexus, and that there's all the different human beings are these centers of points between the sun, moon, and earth, and that's how everyone's birth chart and transits are that. And we can see different perspectives by looking at each other's and ourselves, and develop a higher communion with the spiritual beings that are the archetypes. That was too tangenty or random, but thanks, Karsten. I really appreciate your comments as well. It's really excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. So there both is and is not one solar system for each human being. Like, we each have our own relationship based on the transits between our natal chart and the current positions. And so there's this interplay of the unique relationship each individual human being has to the heavenly movements, and the fact that we all share one sky. So we have just a minute left. Angus, if you want to have the last word here.
Yeah, sure. Karsten, thanks for that. That was so rich. What you were saying there with intellectual perception or intellektuelle Anschauung was so interesting, because as you were describing it, it's like coming from this, it's like 3D out in the world, as like into the center point, moving from the three to the to the individual, to the ideal point that Chad was just talking about. What you were doing for me there was repeating Steiner scaling back from 3D to 2D to 1D. He says, I'll read it from the text, it's under 3A. Now, for an understanding of what was said before about the human being, we have not yet gone for enough. We must go farther and make a second dimension also vanish. So then we shall be left with only one, with a straight line. But this is no ordinary straight line drawn into three-dimensional space. It is a line that has remained when we have made the third and also the second dimension vanish. And now we must make the last remaining one vanish, and we are left with a mere point. That's what you reminded me of so strongly there. So thank you. One more thing, just adding a little bit about Goethe, that it was Schiller that made Goethe aware that he was actually like having an intellectual apperception. He wouldn't have known it without the knowledgeable philosopher Schiller by his side to tell him, which I think is also an interesting aspect to what you pointed out there. But really rich, Carsten. Thank you.
We may
Our
have
host
lost
disappeared.
our host, yeah. I'm assuming, or there they come back. It might have something to do with the PCC program needing the host.
Hey, sorry, everyone. I had to drop out because I have another course that's starting a minute ago. But
Okay.
Usually it lets me run 2 concurrent meetings, but it didn't this time. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to kick you all out now.
Okay.
Look forward to next week, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks so much,
Thanks, everyone.